and welcome to Climate Chat. I am your host, Dan Miller, and today we have our special guest, Michael Grunwald, who's the author of a new book, We Are Eating the Earth, which focuses on agriculture's impact on climate change, which is, I would say, a well-known yet still underreported subject. And so I'm really happy to have him on. I met Michael at giving a talk at Climate Week. Was that last week or a week before? And really interesting talk. And I met him afterwards and invited him on the show. So Michael, welcome to Climate Chat. It's great to have you here.
Oh, thanks for having me, Dan.
And let's start off with your background, because you haven't been doing like agriculture the whole time, but you are a best-selling author and you've written a number of books. Tell us a little bit about your background.
Yeah, I'm just a hack journalist. Now I'm an unemployed guy. But I spent many years. I was at the Washington Post, Time Magazine, Politico Magazine. And yes, I've written a couple other books. I wrote a book called The Swamp about the Everglades, was really when I started getting into environmental reporting. And I wrote a book called The New Deal, which is about the Obama stimulus, that has a lot about his efforts to sort of start the clean energy revolution in the United States. So yeah, I've been at least writing about environmental issues, if not full-time, at least part-time, for the last 20 years. But I really hadn't written about food and agriculture until I stumbled into this.
And how did you stumble into this? How did you get into agriculture? What brought you to that?
Well, the short answer is, look, I was writing a lot about the environment and climate, and when you start to realize is that uh, agriculture is essentially the largest environmental issue, and it's after fossil fuels, the second largest climate issue, right? It uses 70% of our fresh water. So when you hear about like the Colorado rivers running dry or the aquifers under California are parched, that's because of agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
It's a leading driver of water pollution. When you hear that there's a dead zone the size of Connecticut in the Gulf of Mexico, or these algal blooms in the Great Lakes, that's agriculture. And then it is the leading driver of deforestation, is beef and soy in the Amazon. It's the leading cause of biodiversity loss, of wetland destruction. So it's just a really big deal. And then, as I mentioned, it's about a third. Food and ag is about a third of our climate problem. So really, I realized if I didn't know squat about it, then probably a lot of other people who care about this stuff were also spectacularly ignorant. Mm-hmm. And again, there are thousands of books about energy and climate, and I thought I would try to dig into something new.
Well, great. So this is a big one. And in fact, maybe you could kind of set the stage for us, because on Climate Chat, we do talk about, fossil fuels and replacing with renewables. And we've had a bunch of people on, we'd say, hey, we can get to 100% renewables and things like that. But I don't think people really fully appreciate how big the footprint is of agriculture. So maybe to start off, you can walk us through that a bit.
Right. And so again, I think people do have a sense that it's sort of a climate issue. They know, as you mentioned, there are a lot of fossil fuels in agriculture, right? The diesel tractors, the crop dusters, the automation of factory farms. They've heard about the burping and farting cows, right? The methane that gets a lot of attention and a lot of ridicule, even though it's a real issue. Also, fertilizer, which is literally manufactured from natural gas. That creates a lot of nitrous oxide in addition to its other pollution problems. But the big climate impact of agriculture, and really the big impact of agriculture generally, is that it's eating the earth. It is a land hog, right? It is, people talk about cities and suburbs. They now cover about 1 of every 100 acres on our planet. Farms and pastures cover 2 of every 5. It's an area the size of all of Europe plus all of Asia. We are losing a soccer field worth of tropical forest to agriculture every 6 seconds. And that is, again, as I mentioned, that's terrible for the critters that live in the forests. It's, creates a lot of pollution and erosion and you name it. but it is also a massive climate problem because those forests and wetlands that we're losing, they store a lot of carbon. So when you take down a forest, all that carbon ends up in the atmosphere, but also they are incredible carbon sinks. They absorb carbon from the atmosphere. And so when you take down a forest, you lose those carbon reductions. So I always say that trying to decarbonize the planet while continuing to tear down trees for agriculture, it's like trying to clean your house while smashing your vacuum cleaner to bits in the living room. You're making a huge mess, but you're also crippling your ability to clean up the mess. And that's what we're doing. Unlike energy, which is still a very big problem, but we've at least figured out what we sort of need to do, and we're even starting to do it. The food and ag problem, not only don't we have the answers, when I started working on this, I felt like we didn't even have the questions, and the problem is getting worse every day.
So let's talk a little bit about the amount of land, because you kind of briefly touched on that. So I've heard the thing, I think it was Bill Nye told me that, so that a third of all the non-ice covered land on Earth is used for meat production. That wasn't like all of agriculture, but it's your numbers are
That's
something
about right.
similar to.
That's about right. Yeah, no, that's right. Because remember, because 3/4 of all agricultural land, a little more than that actually, is used to support livestock. About two
Three-fourths, and that
thirds of it
includes
is
growing food for them, right?
exactly 2/3 of it is pasture, and then there's also there's crops that the soy and alfalfa and you name it that we feed to livestock. So yeah, it's about a third of our land overall,
And we're
and
talking about the
it's
whole globe here. We're not just talking about like land in the U.S.
oh yeah,
This is
yeah. In
all
the
the land
U.S.
on Earth.
in the
This is
U.S. it's about half of our land is for agriculture, and part is for animal agriculture,
mm,
and beef is about half of our agricultural land and provides about 3% of our calories. So you can see how
okay. I
cattle are
wanted to ask
really
you about that. So, okay,
cattle are really the land hogs.
wow, half the land for 3% of the calories. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, and then
The, the
of the impact, you kind of briefly you mentioned all these things, but maybe we can put them in perspective. So you have uh, let's just talk about like climate. So like emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. So we have deforestation,
right,
um,
that's the big one.
right, and then we also have um, fossil fuel emissions for agriculture, and we also
Right.
have methane from cows and from rice and from other things.
And
So
nitrous oxide from fertilizer and
okay,
manure
and
as
that's
well.
okay.
Yeah,
Let's throw
yeah,
that in there.
yeah.
So of all of those things, how much is the deforestation piece versus those others? Or
It's a little bit hard to say. It's a little bit hard to be precise, right? Because as I mentioned, the land sector piece of it is also reducing emissions, and so deforestation eliminates those emissions reductions. But in generally, I would say deforestation is more than half the problem,
okay,
um, and it's and we are on track to deforest another dozen California's worth of land by 2050 to feed a growing population. And as you know, we don't have another dozen California's worth of forest sitting around. So it really is that is the emergency. That's why I'm sort of waving my hands in the air and saying, like, we are eating the earth because we really do have to eat less of it. Even if we stopped using all fossil fuels, not just for agriculture, but generally all over the world tomorrow, we would still be on track to blow through 2 degrees Celsius of warming just from deforestation from agriculture.
well, I think as we covered on this show, we're on track to blow through to C, even with without the agriculture component in there, no matter
Yeah.
what. But because we also covered accelerated warming and the higher ECS than people think, equilibrium climate sensitivity. Yeah,
Well,
so
a
we
lot of the
covered that as
IPCC
well.
a
Yeah.
lot of the IPCC reports, and I've been very tough on the IPCC
Hmm.
for the way they have sort of hand waved away a lot of our land use problems. They just take for granted. Most of their scenarios assume that deforestation ends by 2030. And
Really?
it doesn't look like deforestation is going to end by
Oh my God.
2030. Yeah, they get to net zero by 2030, and that's where you see
All right,
Yeah,
'cause
it's they make a lot of really rosy assumptions about the land sector, because it's hard. And as I know, we're going to get into carbon farming. One of the
mm,
uh, one of the big assumptions they make is that, well, yeah, even if we continue to have a lot of emissions, that we're going to reverse a lot of those emissions by through kinder and gentler farming, that is going to sort of repatriate all that bad carbon up in the sky as sort of
mm,
good carbon in the
in the
soils
soil.
underneath farms. And yeah, it's a pretty big assumption.
So before we get to that, one back on the land, the incredible amount of land that is used for
Yeah,
agriculture. Now, of course, that's been actually going on for thousands of years.
that's
We've
right.
been, changing the earth and making pastures for cattle and goats and whatever for a
That's
very,
right.
very long time.
We had deforested, our ancestors deforested an entire South America worth of forest, before the Industrial Revolution.
Okay, that's what,
So right, everybody talks about, like, oh, the problem is industrial agriculture. Well, the problem is agriculture. Agriculture makes a mess.
yeah. And so when you talk about what's going on now and the impact, you're actually talking about the incremental deforestation that's occurring right now. I mean, yeah, all that was there and we had a stable climate up until the Industrial Revolution. But not only have fossil fuel emissions done this, but now deforestation is also accelerating. I assume is it
That's right. No, I mean, I think it's funny. You can see in the ancient pollen samples and ice cores that actually the early deforestation from agriculture did create measurable global warming. And in
right?
fact, this is kind of macabre. But the great dying of the indigenous people in the Americas after European contact actually created measurable global cooling, because they were, a lot of commentary about them sort of portrays them as sort of like, primitive noble savages, but they were very many of them were very sophisticated farmers. And after they were wiped out through genocide as well as through disease, a lot of their farms basically naturally returned to forest and other vegetation, and that created measurable global cooling.
Wow. And also, by the way,
Yeah.
one of our co-hosts not here today, but Leon Simons, who co-wrote "Global Warming in the Pipeline" with Jim Hansen, I think it was in that paper, they spoke about how it might have been a follow-on paper where they spoke about how our pre-industrial agriculture actually created some emissions that stabilized the climate. Why was it so
Right. It
stable
helped
for
it.
8,000
It
years?
helped
Well,
avoid. That's right.
rice
It helped
putting out
avoid an ice age.
methane and all this deforestation
That's right.
added. We should have been cooling this whole time, and we were very, very
It
stable.
it helped avoid a second ice age. That's exactly right.
Wow.
It's it,
But now,
basically what I'm saying is it's a big frickin' deal. And
right.
our agriculture. Look, we gotta eat, right? And it is true. Like, we had this incredible green revolution, that tripled crop and livestock yields,
Mhm.
right, through better seeds, better fertilizer, better chemicals, irrigation projects, more automation. Yes, these factory farms. And so that means without the green revolution, which a lot of people hate, we would need 3 times as much land to make the amount of food that we're making today. So things would be way worse if we
Well,
hadn't increased
we would
those
have a
yields.
lot fewer people,
We
and we'd
would
have a lot
indeed
less
have a lot
climate change,
fewer.
obviously. I mean,
We
the
would
Green
have a lot
Revolution
fewer
fueled
people,
climate
but
change, right? I mean,
well, it fueled, it helped support population growth. And, a lot of people thought we were going to have, massive famines that were going to wipe out huge, billions of people. And that didn't happen. And I think that's nice for the billions of us who get to be here.
yeah.
But again, it does have an impact. And if we had lower yield agriculture, that would have a bigger impact, because if you make less food per acre, you need more acres to make food.
Hmm, hmm. Okay. So, um, we talked about that. All right. So now let's get back to meat, because we talk about
Mhm.
agriculture. Everyone thinks of vegetables and whatever, and corn and wheat. But as you said, meat has this really outsized impact. So put that in perspective for us, like beef, and then by the way,
Sure.
all versus like all of meat.
Sure. Well, I mean, when you think about like a chicken, right? You have to feed a chicken about 9 calories worth of plants, whatever their feed is, to get 1 calorie worth of meat, right? And that makes sense, right? Because that those plants are supporting, it's supporting their beaks and their clucking and their pooping and and all kinds of feathers and chicken things that don't produce meat, right? It's a sort of it's a middleman. It's an inefficient converter of their feed into our food. And then what I try to point out is that cattle are about 10 times more inefficient, 10 times use 10 times more land and create 10 times more emission per, gram of protein or per calorie than poultry or pork. So beef are really the baddies. And and obviously, like, beef is delicious. I stopped eating it when I started working on this book. And people told me I wouldn't miss it, but I really miss it. But
I do.
again, it's if you want to reduce your own personal dietary impact on the climate, the easiest thing, by far the most impactful thing you can do is to eat less beef, because that really is the baddie. I mean, dairy obviously comes from cattle as well, but cows produce milk like, a few times a day, and they produce beef like once in their lifetime.
Right.
So beef is, and lamb as well are really inefficient and really driving deforestation, not just in the Amazon, but worldwide.
So I stopped eating beef too a long time ago, and I didn't miss it actually. I mean, after like
No, really.
after a few weeks, and I have an Impossible Burger, which I think tastes better than the originals. But we're probably going to get
Ooh,
to
I
that
mean, look,
later,
I
I
think
think.
it's good. I think they're good. I
Uh,
like I like Impossible Burgers, but I will say that I'm not a big fan of Beyond Burgers, and I've said this to the CEO. But I do think, like, I can tell the difference. That's it. Now I've had some of the lab grown. It's really cultivated meat.
yeah.
Cultivated beef is the better way to put it. That's grown from basically bovine cells in a
Hmm.
in a fermenter or a bioreactor, really in a brewery, and that tastes like beef. It is beef. It's actual cow muscle, and it's delicious. And you hear the 2 million years of evolution saying like hello.
I tried some cultivated salmon, and I have to say it wasn't. I mean, this was probably early on, so I don't think it was quite there yet. It has that one had a little while to go. But so tell us more about this, because when I think of how are we going to solve this issue, which you're writing about in your book, one way is precision fermentation, where you basically make better tasting, healthier, cheaper meat. Maybe obviously not right away, all those things, but um and then if people don't have a psychological aversion to it for some reason, we could actually really take this on. So what's your feeling on your thoughts on that?
Well, I have a couple chapters in the book where I sort of tell um, the story. I mean, I guess you can. I don't like to call it the rise and fall, because that implies that this stuff is never coming back. I call it more the boom and the bust, but of this sort of alternative protein movement. Because remember, I started my reporting for this book in 2019 at the
Hmm.
Good Food Institute conference, which is kind of the convening of all the different sort of fake meat and fake dairy, different companies. And this was right after Beyond Meat had gone public. It was worth like a third as much as Tyson Foods. There were serious conversations about whether alternative proteins were going to replace meat in 10 years or 15 years. My joke was that I thought I was going to accidentally raise a Series A round on the drinks line. Um, and then I sort of, as I was finishing my reporting, I went back to the GFI conference in 2023, and there it was sort of doom and gloom. Beyond had gone from $250 a share to $2 a share. The investors had all fled the space. What were we thinking? That we could take down this incredibly powerful, entrenched, subsidized $2 trillion industry. And basically, all doom and gloom, and it's over. It was just a fad. And I feel like the sort of irrational pessimism is as excessive as the irrational exuberance was. Look, I think
Well, look
You know,
at
the sort of the dogs.
solar PV was that way for
Exactly.
30 years. I
And
mean,
this, and
you
solar
did
took,
it
yeah,
because you
solar.
wanted to be good or, whatever. You had no
Well, it
choice,
took
maybe.
50 years. It took
Yeah.
50 years to be relevant, right? And
Mhm.
there was like, and now it's finally, reaching some critical mass. But again, there was $500 billion spent in the solar industry last year. There's been $3 billion spent on cultivated meat in its entire history, public and private. So again, I feel like it was a really great technological achievement by these plant-based meat companies to make meat out of plants that was 90% as good as the real thing and only cost maybe 50% more. But
Right.
who's going to buy that if you're not writing a book about food and climate? So I
Right.
think people tried it out of novelty and then they decided, well, that's interesting, but it's not as good. So they didn't come back to it. But what I like to point out is that the cow is a pretty mature technology and this stuff isn't.
Right.
It can still get cheaper, it can still get tastier, and it can still get healthier. And I think that it's right. And you're exactly right to bring up the sort of solar analogy because alternative proteins is really the best analogy we have to alternative energy, right? The
Mhm.
idea is that just as like Tesla, they put out a product and they didn't say, buy this car because it's good for the earth. They just said, buy this really great car.
Yeah.
Um, and certainly the alternative protein companies have tried to do that. Um,
Well,
for the most part, like other than the plant-based nuggets, which in blind taste tests they're just as good as chicken nuggets. Because I mean, who even knows what the hell's in a chicken
what a
nugget
chicken
anyway,
nugget
right?
tastes like.
Yeah, it's just like a
All the
vehicle for
fry on the
stealth.
outside anyway,
But
so
those are really as good a product, and so there's really no reason to eat a chicken nugget anymore. And the hope is that that will, that's going to be a big part of the solution. It isn't yet. I write about dozens of promising solutions in my book, and none of them really have any traction. Like plant-based meat is still less than 1% of the meat market.
is it?
But the hope is as it gets better, as it gets cheaper, that it'll start to get competitive as well.
I also thought Impossible came out and they priced their product higher than beef as,
Yeah.
they sort of
It's
bring a shine to it or something like that. But,
Well, I don't think they were trying to bring a shine to it. I
they
think
had
their
to do it.
costs are just still too high. Yeah, it's just
Hmm.
um, and uh, and unfortunately, with cultivated meat, which they've brought down the price like 99.9%, and they're just ready to go to market, but they're still going to have to price it even in blended form. They'll blend it with plant based, and they'll still have to price it like an organic premium product.
Hmm.
So it's difficult, but again, like
But
there
it's
are
a
no
20%
economies of
saving
scale
for
yet.
every doubling of Swanson's law,
E-
20%
exactly.
decrease in price for every doubling. And I think it's also similar to EVs and to fossil fuel cars. Fossil fuel cars, very mature technology. It doubled and doubled for the last 100 years, and price is what it is. It's not going to come down much. Whereas EVs, especially batteries, are dropping 90% every 10 years. It's some crazy thing like that.
That's right. Right. Obviously, the danger, and we're starting to see it on the meat side too, is that just how, like a decade ago, electric vehicles were seen as Obama mobiles. You're already seeing, the alternative proteins getting caught up in the culture war. And so, right. So, like, plant based meat are like Biden burgers. And you already see, like, I live in Florida, and there are now 7 red states have already banned lab grown meat or cultivated meat even before it's made it to market. The idea being that it's sort of woke meat, and of course, there
The
a
beef.
lot of them have donors in the cattle industry that don't really like the competition. So I do think this is going to be a political as well as a technological struggle. But again, the
Any
uh,
prediction
the
for
arc of
time
history
frame?
is long. Sorry.
Well, no, we
Well,
don't
I
have a
think
lot of time. What do you
no,
think? Do you
that's
think
true.
in,
That's
let's say, 2030, do you think it will be an important part of the food system by then? 5
2030, I
years?
think, barely. What I have some I have I'm getting excited about some of the cultivated meat that's the work that's happening. It's really coming down the cost curve quickly, and that could scale quickly. And I think you're going to see more of the kind of blended products. Yeah, by 2030, you'll see a decent amount on the market. But to really move the climate needle, I think we're talking about 2040, which is why when I talk about actually, making shifts and reducing emissions, I tend to talk more about the supply side, about food waste, which is another, that's on the demand side. That's a big problem where we waste a quarter of the world's food, which means we waste a quarter of the land we use to grow the food, right? We use a landmass the size of China to grow garbage, and we waste all that fertilizer, we waste water, and there, unlike trying to get people to eat less beef, which they love, people don't really love wasting food. And companies, groceries, restaurants particularly don't like wasting food. So I think there's some hope there. And then, as I mentioned, on the supply side, where I've seen all kinds of really cool technologies to try to increase yields, whether it's or reduce emissions. I like to talk about there are biofertilizers where they're gene editing microbes to snatch nitrogen out of the air and feed it to crops so that you don't have to bomb the fields with chemicals, or biopesticides where they're using the mRNA technology behind the COVID vaccines to literally constipate beetles to death. I visited the University of Illinois. They are literally trying to reinvent photosynthesis. They're using artificial intelligence and modern genomics and big data to essentially engineer out some of these real inefficiencies in the photosynthetic process. And they think they can increase crop yields 50% in 20 years. And that means they'll need 50% less land to make the same amount of food. So I think there's a lot of exciting stuff going on. Some of them I think are closer to reaching scale than others.
I gave a TED talk, God, more than 10 years ago, on hydrogels for agriculture. So hydrogels are these super absorbent polymers that originally developed by the USDA to help farmers grow more food with less water, but then they found out they were toxic and expensive, all these kind of things. So it took another 20, 30 years before, new ones came out that were non-toxic and cheaper and lasted longer and all these things. And so I gave a talk on that, and you can grow 20% more food with 20% less water, or the same amount of food with 50% less water. It's
and
that's been
seeing that
around, but it's hard. Some of these take a long time to catch on.
We're seeing like rice. You mentioned that rice fields produce a lot of methane because when they're flooded, the anaerobic, it goes anaerobic, and these bacteria start to produce a lot of methane. But it turns out that they're really pretty simple strategies, which is like the most common one is called alternative wetting and drying, where basically you just keep the field flooded for shorter durations, and you can reduce your methane emissions 50%. And so they're having incredible success in Arkansas, but also I was talking to somebody who's doing that in India, and he's got 35,000 rice farmers reducing their methane emissions in half. And so again, these are things that it's just how do you get it to scale?
Are they
And
getting carbon credits for that?
they are selling carbon credits for $20-$30 a ton. And for, if you're a smallholder rice farmer in India, the idea of getting an extra $100 a year, that can like double your profits. So there's a lot of exciting stuff out there. Again, but a lot of them do have to do with, first of all, it's modern technology, like, gene editing, GMOs, and it's like, boo, GMOs, we hate that, right? It's like, yuck, technology, we don't want that near our food. And then it does, and part of it is this idea that we want high yield production, efficient agriculture. And efficiency has also become this kind of dirty word where it's like, boo, corporations dredging dollars out of
Industrial
the
agriculture,
dirt. Yeah, exactly. And this is, we're starting to get a little bit towards your, the carbon farming, thing in the title of talk. But there is like some of the best opportunities are, you go to South America, to Brazil, where you see these horribly, just incredibly degraded and inefficient ranches where you have like, one cow for every 10 acres and they all look like they're on hunger strikes. And with very, modest investments in infrastructure and new grasses and, fertilizing the pastures and sometimes adding a feedlot, which again, a lot of people don't like, but it's not that difficult to triple or quadruple those yields. And if you're using, if you're getting 3 or 4 times as much food per acre, you're using 1/3 or 1/4 as much of the Amazon. And that's, to me, like, really exciting, and the kind of thing that, again, it's not to scale yet. Um, but and you have vegans don't like they get angry at me when I talk about sort of more efficient beef, because they think I should just say, don't eat any beef. And
Mhm.
then a lot of the beef industry is like, we just like things the way they are. So they don't like that. And then, of course, you have these regenerative farmers who are just like, no, the answer is sort of kinder and gentler, and farming that will magically repatriate all that carbon from the sky to the soil. And they don't like hearing about higher yields either. But so it's not always popular. But I do think there are real opportunities to spare a lot of land by increasing yields.
So before we get to carbon, well, this is a little bit like carbon farming, but Alan
Yeah.
Savory,
Yeah.
I was at that TED conference when he gave that talk and saying that cows can solve climate change if you just have them roam around
Yeah.
a certain way.
And it only has
I
like
knew it was a
72
scam at the
billion
time, but
hits on
can you just
YouTube.
tell us? But did you have that in your book, by the way, the Alan Savory, or
Oh
no?
yeah, 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 yeah. It's not the cow, it's the how, right?
Right.
It's mostly the cow. And again, to the extent it's the how, it's mostly about how efficiently and productively you can increase your grazing yields. Now that said, um, part of so we'll discuss this. I think part of this notion from Alan Savory, but also on the cropping side from the Rodale Institute, is this idea that we're going to just, that if we could just increase the amount of carbon in our soils, our agricultural soils, by 0.4%, we could reverse global warming. That is almost entirely bogus. Soil carbon is really hard, and whether you're grazing or cropping, um, it's we'll get into a little bit of the science of that, but it's been wildly overstated and sometimes just completely made up. That said, some of those Allen Savory practices really can help increase yields, um,
Okay.
and if they can, that's awesome. Like, then I'm all for it, for regenerative grazing, rotational grazing. And I saw some of those really high yield farms in Brazil, some of those ranches. Yes, they fertilize their pastures in ways that Michael Pollan would not approve of, and
Mhm.
they did have feedlots, because feedlot beef is way more efficient than grass-fed beef, and way better for the climate than organic, regenerative, you name it. But they were doing a lot of regenerative practices too. They did have the rotational grazing. They were letting their cattle graze on cover crops as well. So they were integrating the crops with the livestock. Um, so again, it's like, I think there's something that everybody's in their silo when it comes to agriculture, and I do think the industrial people can learn from the regenerative people, and vice versa, and they can all learn from the alternative protein people, the foodies, the hippies, the the aggies. Um, there's definitely there's so much ideology in this world. So many of these fights have become like kind of political and cultural fights.
Mhm.
But I think a lot of them are a lot of these are technical issues, and people can learn, and there is a fair amount of common ground to steal the name of that terrible regenerative movie that claims that carbon farming is going to reverse global warming.
So before we get into that next, I did want to pop up this is the book, by the way, everyone, and there's links in the
Oh yeah.
description to go find it, or you can get it anywhere. So let but so back to that. So before we dive in, well, let's dive into regenerative ag and carbon farming. But could you first please define that for us so we know what we're talking
Oh, yeah, yeah. Good luck, right? I mean, that's one of the big fights in this. It's not organic. There are very specific kind of, to get certified as an organic farmer. There are certain things you have to do. You can't use pesticides, can't use synthetic fertilizer, et cetera, et cetera. Regenerative right now is very much a kind of like, it's a vibe, and it's a vibe, by the way, that is not just being pushed by environmentalists and philanthropists, although boy, they really are pushing it. But it's also big ag, Archer Daniels Midland, big food, General Mills and Mars and PepsiCo and Danone. Everybody loves this idea of regenerative ag. Now, there are some regenerative practices that we kind of know what they are, right? It's sort of like no-till farming, or at least less till farming, so you're not disturbing the ground as much. Cover crops, so that the ground is always covered. It's not bare to the elements, so there's less erosion. You're using none or fewer chemicals, synthetic chemicals, for fertilizer and pesticides, herbicides, fungicides. Although I will point out that a lot of the big no-till farmers end up using more herbicides because they need to get rid of their weeds. Again, the rotational grazing, sort of thoughtful, managed grazing, is definitely part of it. So these are the kind of regenerative practices, and I do think. Although, what is exactly a regenerative farm? It's, people can argue about that. But I think those are it's sort of basically trying to farm more like nature. And I think.
How about carbon farming then?
So carbon farming is specifically, the idea is that those particular practices will end up increasing your soil organic carbon. That's a very specific idea. And soils do hold a lot of carbon. I think it's 3 times more than the atmosphere.
Right.
And so there's this idea that, like, well, if they could just hold a little bit more, initially, if you watch like Kiss the Ground, where you have Woody Harrelson's the narrator sort of saying like, we can totally reverse global warming, like all that carbon is going to just come back to the soil where it belongs. And that is bogus. And now even the regenerative people, although Common Ground makes some of the same arguments, but the scientists, some of whom really used to push that line that you could reduce 55 gigatons of emissions every year just through kinder and gentler farming. Now they say, well, no, it's just one solution. It can do 3 or 4 gigatons. Of course, there's really no science for that either. A lot of the science is kind of this idea that, well, there's all this soil, and if we could just put a little more carbon in it, that would be a lot more soil carbon, which is kind of like, I have this vault in the bank. If it were full of money, I would have a lot of money in it. But there's not really, there's not a lot of proof that these strategies are going to put more money in that carbon bank. And in fact, there's quite a lot of evidence that it doesn't. I mean, you're starting to see, and there was just a kind of few of us skunks at the garden party who were complaining about some of these regenerative practices, in terms of that the carbon farming science wasn't there. And now you're starting to see more recognition that this stuff is very hard to measure, for one thing. Like if you take these, it's a very laborious process to take a soil sample to measure the carbon. And then it turns out that not only is it like, just specific to that region or maybe that farm, but even like a few feet away, you could get a totally different measurement. But then it's also, if you do manage to store carbon underground, and it's like, great, pay me the money. But then if you till that soil the next day, all that carbon goes back into the sky and you don't have to give the money back. So there are permanence questions. There are all kinds of,
permanence.
they're just all very, very difficult to measure this stuff, and people have recognized it. But what I think there's increasing science that suggests not only is it difficult to measure, but when you can measure it, you find that there's almost zero. And that is mostly
the no-till
because
thing was part of that. I mean, there was then a paper came out saying that no-till doesn't actually save more.
Right, exactly. First, it was like no-till is going to save the world, and those early carbon markets were all about no-till.
Right.
And then some more carbon science came out that said, well, actually, no-till increases carbon a little bit, in the top few inches of topsoil. But if you dig a meter down, there's no difference whatsoever. But the carbon markets didn't change their approach at all. They're just like, oh, well, we don't care. That's a problem. Then there are all these studies. I mean, it sounds like I'm making this up, but if you read the studies and you read the commentary on the studies, you hear a lot of, they'll say like, hey, regenerative practices can contribute to massive reductions in massive increases in soil carbon, and it's really wonderful. And then you look at the you look at the study and they'll say like, well, for example, if you take a drained peatland and you restore it to a peatland, that stores a ton of carbon. And it's like, yes. And if you take a pasture and you restore it to a forest, that stores a ton of carbon. And then also, no-till does a tiny bit of carbon, and cover crops do a tiny bit of carbon. But if you put it all together, regenerative practices like cover crops and no-till contribute to massive amounts of soil carbon. When most of those increases are from stopping agriculture, not from regenerative agriculture, from like, restoring natural buffers around the stream. So there's a lot of bogusness there. And then there's also this there's been science out of Australia that's been replicated everywhere that finds that, and I'm oversimplifying a little, but basically to get more carbon in your soil, you need to put more nitrogen in your soil. And that creates all kinds of other climate problems, from manure, from fertilizer, from nitrous oxide. And so it's
there are some cool things happening in that regard, like fertilizers that would create themselves on the field and capture capture nitrogen from the air and feed it to the plant. Right?
Exactly. But increasing nitrogen use efficiency, that's all good. But the idea that you're going to store more carbon in the soil, usually when you see these, like, there are a couple of stars, they're in all the documentaries. They've got big consulting businesses because they go and they say like, I went from 1% carbon in my soil to 5%. And it's like, well, how did you do it? And what you find is they used to have crops and now they turned it into pastures. And so they have cows pooping on it all the time. But first of all, somewhere else, they're going to have to grow more crops to replace those crops. And second of all, those cows came from somewhere else and now they're not pooping over there. So they have less soil carbon over there, and they don't. So part of what I'm saying is carbon farming is not going to save us. There are some ways where you can, some cover crops that naturally fix nitrogen from the air and put it in the soil, then you can get a little bit more soil carbon. There are some of these grazing practices, that make more efficient use of manure. That's great. And it can also increase a little bit of soil carbon. But in general, this idea and the carbon markets are just gung-ho for, we are going to pay farmers because everybody loves paying farmers. That's always very popular. So the UN loves this. The FAO loves this. The World Bank loves this. The carbon markets love it. Everybody loves this idea that we're just going to pay farmers more money. And of course, the farmers love it. And we're going to reward them for the carbon they're storing underground. But there are much more cost-effective ways to encourage farmers to reduce emissions. And this is just about the least effective and is getting the most money, the most political juice, the most excitement.
So the Betteridge's law of headlines, and any headline that's written as a question can always be answered with the word no. But in our case, is carbon farming a scam? Maybe the answer is perhaps yes.
Mostly. I would say mostly.
Okay.
Yeah, I wouldn't say 100, not 100%, but you just should be very, very, and I do tell some stories, some kind of harrowing stories in the book of like there were of some IPCC inside the IPCC, but then also just like some of these carbon market companies that were told, and very specifically, like, you do not have any science behind this, but immediately went to market with it anyway, and were within months valued as a $3 billion company because this is going to be the wave of the future. And remember, like, if you're Microsoft or JP Morgan and you want to buy cheap carbon credits, and somebody's saying like, here, I'll verify these soil carbon credits and they're cheap, like, what do you care? Like, you'll buy it. And so
I think a few of those do actually care, and they have their own scientists that are evaluating it themselves.
Yeah, but they get to count it as a reduction in their scope 3 emissions, whether they're whether the emissions are real or not, as long as somebody's verifying it. And it's really created this race to the bottom. And in that sense,
that's a
the
big
carbon
markets,
markets,
the whole tree. I mean, growing trees. I mean, that's been classic one that's
Exactly.
been not fully debunked, but we had
No,
Kevin
because of
Anderson.
additionality. Yeah.
We had Kevin Anderson on, asked him about trees, and his quote was, "Plant trees for good tree reasons. Don't plant them for carbon reasons." So,
Well, I mean, you could imagine a way it would be good, but it's like, yeah, you have to deal with the leakage and additionality problems. And these carbon markets, to go
well,
back
some
to
of it.
this idea, I mean, part of my what I'm banging my spoon in my high chair about with this book is that land is not free, and that we have to think about the cost of using land. That land, every acre really is sacred, and the current carbon markets and really climate analysis in general has sort of hand waved away the importance of land. It has treated land as if it was free. So, right now, if you had one of those really efficient ranches down in Brazil and you wanted to access the carbon markets, you wanted to get paid for carbon credits, the smartest thing you could do is redegrade your land. So, instead of having, like, 1 cow per acre, go back to having 1 cow per 10 acres, because then you have fewer cows, so less methane. So you're not you've reduced your methane emissions. You're not fertilizing your pastures, so you're reducing your nitrous oxide emissions. And the bad impacts of what you're doing are felt outside your ranch, right? It means you're producing less food, so we're going to have to use way more of the Amazon to make up for it. But you're not rewarded for anything you do for
So
reducing
that
the
is
need
very
to make
interesting.
more
Yeah.
food. And so I do think, this is why we need a new land ethic. We need to think about how we're eating the earth, and we need to come up with approaches for public policy, for carbon markets, private markets, that encourage us to eat less of the earth and reward farmers for doing things that get us to eat less of the earth.
Okay. By the way, one thing back on the soil carbon, there was a paper, it might have been 5 years ago, saying that as you increase the global temperature, emissions from the soils are going to increase, and they estimated at 2C, which we're going to be at next decade, we would emit around a little more than 300 gigatons of carbon. Translating that to CO2 was essentially a trillion tons from the soils getting emitted as we increase the temperature. I don't know if you saw that, but that's
These are
like to wipe out
like,
any possible benefit you're getting for a few gigatons here and there.
and let's remember, like, to go back to some of these larger climate pictures. The climate is it's one like our trees, our forests right now are taking about a quarter of our carbon out of the atmosphere.
Hmm.
And they're doing that at a more rapid rate. Like, forests are growing faster than they would
Higher
otherwise
CO2.
because they are being fertilized by all this carbon in the air.
Right.
And and obviously a lot of climate deniers point that out, and they're like, see, carbon's good. Obviously we don't want to have a lot of carbon in the atmosphere, but it is fertile. Like, the problem would be even worse if it wasn't over fertilizing these forests that are growing faster than they would otherwise. So,
But you got vapor pressure
again,
deficit, and then you have heat stress and bark beetle and floods and
yeah,
fires, and
indeed.
you get, so yes, there's this one positive
And that's
thing.
and that's a drag on. That's I talk about that a lot too, because we are going to need to increase our crop and livestock yields even faster over the next 30 years than we have over the last 60 years since the Green Revolution began. And we're going to have to do that at a time when heat waves and droughts
Right.
and floods, as you mentioned, but also pests and diseases, crop diseases, are moving to areas that are
Northern.
getting warmer. And so, you're talking about wheat yields. This could be dragged down as much as a third by various climate impacts, which just means this is going to be really hard. And we need to start working on this shit now.
Wow. So, I do want to ask you about biofuels, but I also want to talk to you about the solutions. You kind of hinted at some of those. What do you think we, and we being, I don't know, collectively, and then maybe also what individuals can do, but what can we do? What kind of policies can we put in place? What kind of actions can we take that you think would have a strong positive impact in this area?
Well, first of all, I think we need to really, as I mentioned, none of these strategies really have much traction yet. And we don't even know which ones are going to work. And so we ought to be right now the administration in the United States is slashing money for agricultural research. We ought to be doing the opposite. We ought to be just like investing in all of these. We gotta, as the main character of my book points out, we need to hurry the fuck up and figure shit out. Was his mantra, and we really do need to do that. And it's crazy that we're heading the opposite direction. And then once we do figure out things that work, such as some of those pasture improvements in Brazil, and some of the green revolution stuff that we could export to the rest of the world. We really do need to, just like with on the energy side, where it was like research what works and then deploy. We've got to deploy on the food and ag side too. And then basically, a lot of what I'm talking about is a combination of let's not do the bad stuff. And so you mentioned biofuels. Biofuels are horribly inefficient. They are worse for the planet and the climate than fossil fuels. It takes
Stop right there, by the way. That's an important statement you just made that no one knows. You may just repeat that again.
Well, biofuels are worse than fossil fuels, about twice as bad, at least. If you're and that's farm grown fuels. And if you are using good farmland to grow fuel, you're going to need to replace
ethanol.
that farmland somewhere else. Corn ethanol, soy biodiesel. You need to replace that farmland somewhere else, and it's not going to be a parking lot. It's going to be a forest or a wetland that stores a lot of carbon, and you're going to eat more of the earth. And right now, again, biofuels are eating about a Texas worth of the earth, while agriculture is eating 75 Texases worth of the earth. But they're now talking about using biofuels in planes. They call it sustainable aviation fuel.
Right.
And if we just replaced a quarter of the world's aviation fuel with crops, we would require 40% of the world's cropland. So that's total disaster, and we need to head the other direction on that. So yes, like no biofuels. We want to move the opposite. We don't want to. The people are talking about a $4 trillion transition to basically a regenerative agricultural world. I think if that is right now, organic farms have about a 40% yield hit. That would require 40% more land. I don't think we want to go in that direction. Sri Lanka did that. They went all organic. They banned agrochemicals. They had a massive crash in yields. They had food shortages, food riots. Wow. The government fell. Not good. So first, do no harm. That would be some of the policies. And then, we want to put in incentives for farmers. We want the carrots for farmers to adopt some of these, emissions reducing technologies, whether it's feed additives that get cows to burp less methane, or trees that grow, like a tree called pongamia I write about, which is really kind of a miracle tree. It's like soybeans, but it grows as a tree, so it stores carbon, and it has like 10 times the yields of soybeans. We need to get this stuff deployed around the world. It isn't happening yet. And then globally, we need an approach that's basically, the WRI, the World Resources Institute, calls it produce and protect, where you want to encourage places like, basically in the developing world, you want to help them get their farmers to have even higher yields. But the problem with that, because that's good, because then they can make food with less land. But the problem is, a farmer who could have higher yields, the first thing they want to do is cut down more trees and make more food. And so you have to tie those carrots to help these developing countries make more food with sticks, where the money gets cut off if they cut down their trees. So they need to produce and protect, and that has to be tied to each other. Right now, the world gives out $300 billion a year in agricultural subsidies, and there are mostly no strings attached. We need to start attaching some strings, and the strings have to be attached to basically better environmental outcomes.
And how about as an individual? I think you kind of hinted at one earlier. Maybe eat no beef, I guess.
The two biggies are eat less beef and waste less food. I could give you 50 things to do, but those have just an outsized impact. And those are the two biggest things you can do. And it really does make a difference. Like, I know it's like, your individual carbon footprint, it's just a drop in the bucket, but drops fill buckets. And the average American eats the equivalent of 3 burgers a week. And if we only ate 2, we would save the equivalent of a Massachusetts worth of land every year. So this stuff really does add up. Um,
Now,
you're
there's also veganism. So how much more would that help? Because
so going vegan is even better. That's the best diet, but for most people, for most vegetarian, like going vegetarian is also great, but most vegetarians eat more dairy, and like I said, cattle are really the problem. So my diet, where I've cut out beef and lamb, that's about as good as going vegetarian for most people. But yes,
really,
vegan is the best. If you can go vegan, and a lot of people tell me, like, why did you write this book when the answer is so simple? We just all need to go
right.
vegan. And I'm like, well, the world ate 450 million tons of meat last year. How's that going? So again, it's like
Yeah,
I
yeah.
try to say,
We've done some of that on
perfect
climate chat.
usually isn't on the menu. Better is better than worse. So, try to do a little better.
Okay, and okay. Now let's get back into something you covered a little bit. We'll end with the sort of the controversial things here. They're all controversial. Organic
Yeah,
food
tell
and
me.
GMO. So some people think it's better for themselves and better for the environment to have certainly. Of course, if you look at a corn that you get non-GMO corn today, and look at the original corn, that corn has been genetically modified as much as the different breeds of dogs have been, but they really mean scientifically genetically modified or something, right?
There's definitely this movement that our food should be natural. And
Correct.
again, like I have no idea, a lot of these people, they're like, "Oh, I'm not eating that fake meat. I'm eating, meat." And it's like, do you know how that meat was grown? Do you know how those chicken have been bred to reach their slaughter weight in 6 weeks? They're so top heavy, so breast heavy that they can barely stand. Their legs break. I mean, it's and then the filth that they're raised in some of these factory farms. I don't know how natural that is. Look, GMOs, they're like the most studied substance on earth, and they seem to be perfectly safe. I will say, like, this is a little dangerous for me because I really do think I've become sort of an expert on the environmental impact of food. On nutrition, I kind of know just enough to be a pain in the ass,
Hmm.
but I will say that in general, how our food is grown has very little impact on our health. It's like what you eat, not how it was grown. And so people are like, GMO corn is in Doritos and Twinkies. And it's like, they're not bad for you because they have GMOs or because they were made through industrial agriculture. They're bad because they're Twinkies and Doritos. They're junk. And so if you want to be healthier, don't eat junk. There's no evidence that organic food is any healthier. I wrote a piece in the New York Times last week saying that glyphosate is just which everybody hates. Ooh, boo, Roundup. It's one of the most benign pesticides out there. There's just no evidence that like you're going to get sick from eating. There's going to be traces of glyphosate in your food. I mean, it's like it is just that science is terrible. It's scaremongering. I think the way to eat healthy is kind of common sense, and yes, like some eating more plants and eating less red meat does seem to be healthier. But this idea that you need to go all organic or that our chemicals or our agricultural chemicals are killing us. There are bad pesticides. There are good pesticides. But the idea that you're getting sick because of pesticides is just it's
Mhm.
usually not true.
Okay. Been
And certainly true
fascinating
of
discussion here,
GMOs.
by the way. I want
Certainly
to
true of GMOs.
say again. What was that?
And certainly true. GMOs are not making you sick.
Right.
It's like, yeah, there's a lot of GMOs in junk food. But so don't eat junk food. But it's not the problem because the GMOs. It's like they have too much sugar. Sometimes they have too much sodium. It's like that's why they're unhealthy.
They're
They're like,
fried and
they're
all that kind of stuff.
yeah, exactly. They're crap. It's not, they're ultra processed food, but it's not the processing that makes it crap. It's the crap.
Okay. Now I want to bring in Stacy or Comad for some question, but I first want to pop up the book again there. We Are Eating the
Yeah, thank
Earth.
you.
and the race to fix our food system and save our climate. So, Michael, it's been a fascinating discussion. Now I'm going to invite Stacy in. Here, let me. I have to jump over to here, and boom. Welcome, Stacy.
Hi, how are you?
How you
Um,
doing, Stacey?
I'm great.
And your cat?
So it's funny, there's been a
Well,
lot of
by the way, just
chatter.
so Michael knows, we're using,
Oh,
climate videos don't get a lot of views, but cat videos get a lot of views. So we're
so
trying
I
to,
know.
yeah, we're trying to up our scores here
okay.
with Rocky. Um, so it's funny, there's been a lot of talk about protein, of course, and I am a big fan of fake meat. Um, this is and Jean was saying, of course, we don't humans don't need fake meat, just eat your vegetables and stuff. But for people like me who were raised on meat and potatoes, it was I gave up meat before fake meat was really, like it was just veggie burgers and stuff. But I didn't really enjoy it. But the getting an Impossible Burger, I was like, oh my gosh, I get to have a burger again, and I don't miss it at all. And I love making it, using it in recipes for people who haven't given up meat yet, and so they can be fooled into thinking it is actual ground beef. And then the one other
That's
thing I
awesome.
want to mention, I saw about, you were talking about biofuels. I totally agree. It's a crime that we have subsidized in this way instead of for food. And but there was a post about SAF that the head of Ryanair said, we're not going to get to the 6% by 2030. It's just not possible. And I'm like, wait a minute, it is. You just have to reduce the amount of fuel that we're consuming. And then 6% can absolutely happen. But when you have those dirt cheap flights that they offer, it incentivizes travel and keeps that whole thing going.
Stacey, do you have your question, and then we should get into the two
Well,
questions?
yeah.
Here,
So
do you want me to respond to any of that,
yeah,
or
please
yeah?
do.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, like I think, I agree. I'm like people don't like it when I say, the industry doesn't like when I call it fake meat. They like alternative proteins. But I'm a huge fan of fake meat. And but I think it's important to remember, like, you're not the target audience for it is true. Like the new, even Beyond Burgers, they're like better than their old, hockey puck veggie burgers. So for vegetarians and vegans, I get it. But the point is to really go after meat eaters. And so far, they've been very successful with that. Unsuccessful, the hope is that they'll get better. And I think actually one place to start is with Rocky. I think that's number three. Number three, if I after eat less beef and waste less food, I do say, like, feed less beef and lamb to your pets, because pets eat a lot of meat too.
Oh my
And the
gosh,
hope
I
is, and
hadn't
there are,
really considered that.
um,
Anybody working on
and certainly
alternative
on the,
proteins for them?
they're starting, yeah. And then I will say on the biofuels, and look, it is true. Like, yeah, we should, yeah, we should. Look, I have solar panels and an electric car, but I fly too much, and we all should fly less, and we should eat less meat, and there are lots of things we ought to do. But the fact is, like, species seems really good at inventing stuff, but not so good at making sacrifices for the planet. And I am trying to push this. It's become a kind of controversial political buzzword, but I am trying to come at this from a kind of abundance mentality that I don't think, I don't think we're going to be very successful just like kind of sort of scolding people and saying, like, you're bad, you're eating too much meat, don't do that, you're flying too much, don't do that either. I think we need to, try to come up with better technological solutions, that can help people get the meat they love, just made out of plants or made out of animal cells or made out of fungi, so without all the deforestation and pollution. And I think that should really be the goal.
I agree. I just wanted to encourage people, if I have some comments and questions here, if you
Mhm.
have them, please leave them. And to remind everyone to please like and subscribe so that more people have a chance to see this. And then if you want to go to Eli and come back.
Is Eli?
I don't know, is he
I
here?
don't see him, but I do see this question here, which is just a one that we didn't really talk about: the role of biochar. With a
Mhm.
lot of discussion on biochar on this channel, because we've had one of the experts is usually in the audience, and we've had him on a couple of times. So, can you comment on biochar at all? And
So I'm sort of not as, I don't know as much about biochar as I should. There are some people who are excited about it. The general consensus is that it ain't there yet. And that right now it sort of takes a lot of wood and a lot of energy to create the biochar, which,
I don't think it takes any
you know,
energy at all. It uses the energy
it
from the wood.
depends how you do it.
You're just
Depends how you
burning
do it,
wood
but
in a furnace
right,
where you don't let oxygen in, so the material becomes C
running
instead of CO2. Basically, is
right, running the furnace. There seems to be like the math doesn't seem to work yet, um, but it's a possibility. I mean, it's sort of like other. In some ways, it's like any other sort of carbon capture. Like you hear a lot about carbon capture, like what is BECS is the word, right? Where it's
Yep.
bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. And there it's like you kind of basically you're burning trees for electricity, but you're capturing and storing the carbon, and therefore it's like quote carbon neutral. It
Mhm.
isn't, because bioenergy is such a disaster. But my thing is always like, well, why not? If why, since bioenergy is actually worse than fossil energy, why not use a gas plant and capture it? I don't know, whether GEX would be even better than BEX. And
Well,
that
once you do
that
that,
would
by the
pencil out
way,
even better.
adding. By the
So
way, you can do that. That is proposed
yeah,
actually, but the problem is, eh, solar and renewables are becoming cheaper than fossil fuel electricity generation. We're talking about now. Uh, anyway, now you add this more expensive thing to the other thing to make it cleaner when you could just buy two or
right.
three times
Well,
as
I'm
much as
saying
the other thing.
right, but what I'm saying is that all those arguments are even worse for bioenergy.
And that's because
And
of the
yeah,
deforestation aspect of it. If you cut down trees
yeah. Although
for
actually,
electricity, then
yes.
somewhere else you're going to cut down trees for food somewhere else.
Well, this is like, and I write about this in the book. Actually burning wood in a power plant puts more carbon than it's terribly inefficient, and it is worse than coal, and not only because, and
Well,
partly because of the deforestation,
but the
and
difference is that the coal is
it
300
is
million years
treated as
old,
carbon.
and the
It is
trees.
treated as carbon neutral. It is treated as carbon neutral, but that is through some accounting errors that I explain in the book. And it's like, this is another like potential massive disaster. And you're actually starting to see, and particularly in Eastern Europe, a lot of those forests are right now being like cut down for bioenergy, and
Okay,
it's
well,
it's no
let's put
bueno.
aside the deforestation aspect for a moment. When
Oh
you
yeah,
burn a
sure. Well,
tree,
other than that, Mrs. Lincoln.
no. I mean, that's why I want to understand. Is there something else that I'm missing?
Well,
But
there is a little bit else, because
because
some of it.
it is carbon that came out of the atmosphere in the last 20, 30 years when you have a tree that's 20 or 30 years old versus
Well, but
carbon came out of the atmosphere 100, 200, 300 million years ago
right,
for
but part
fossil
of it
fuel.
is like, right. I mean, the alternative to burning that tree would be not burning that tree, and then you don't, then you don't have, and if you want to keep it carbon neutral, as this stuff supposedly is, you would need, more trees somewhere else. If this is a tree that would have provided, somebody's house, then you're going to have to cut down another tree because you're using that for energy instead. There also like there's a lot lost in the forest. It is not like one per one, you lose it. So it's a very
Okay.
and wood burns less efficiently than coal or gas. So it is
All right.
it's mallow in many ways, but yeah.
We can do a whole show on that. Okay. So Stacey, what let's see, I had a few.
Yeah, well, John just added on about biochar that, it's good for water retention and supporting diverse microorganism communities, but don't just add it to your soil without first exposing it and filling it with native microorganisms, or it will suck the life out of your soil, which I think is a good
Okay.
thing to note, and I would buy that. And
Interesting.
Here's one, by the way, because you talked about this previously, and I think this shows that they're not understanding what you're saying. It says biofuel isn't necessarily releasing carbon that has been locked up in rock. In other words, it's not a fossil fuel. It's something that came recently, but you're saying it's worse than fossil fuels. Can maybe you briefly explain why?
Because of the land use, essentially. I mean, again, like people think because of bio, right? Bio sounds good. Plants are good. Growing plants is good. Burning plants is bad. And so, yes, you can. And after you burn that plant, you can, then plant a new tree and get some of that back. But you can plant a new tree anyway, right? It's the burning that's bad. It's the burning of that burning trees for energy is where you get the problem. And yes, burning coal for energy also a big problem. But
Doesn't the
as you see,
CO2 go back in the atmosphere no matter what? I mean, you burn a tree. Well, not let's say plants
no,
that you could eat. If they just fall on the ground and they're going to rot away, the CO2 is going to go back in the atmosphere, right?
oh, that's a different question, a more complicated question of like,
Okay.
and the answer is no, because forests are, there are more mature forests and less mature forests.
Okay.
So yeah,
They're building
and
up
this has
carbon.
to do with the, the discount rate that you use for a forest and the discount rate that you use for the trees. That's a legitimate point to raise. But
Okay.
but if you do it and you include the land use costs and and the opportunity costs of wood, um, it's very bad. And of course, like you look in like Britain where they're giving this, I mean, this company Drax, which really does sound like, like
a
the
villain.
corporate version of like a guy twirling his mustache and saying like, "Wahahaha." But they are giving them billions of dollars a year to burn trees that are being grown in the United States, in the Southeast United States, shipped across the Atlantic and burned in British power plants because Britain, because of dumb IPCC accounting, doesn't have to count it as a carbon emission.
That is insane. The one
It
I always
is.
think of is ethanol. It's like it's the Rube Goldberg. It's like hydrogen. It's just this makes no sense. How inefficient it
You
is.
you
Just
will
like
enjoy my book.
yeah,
I I
to
talk about
why
it in great detail. And
yeah.
that's my main character figures out how we're eating the earth originally through biofuels.
It,
Okay. So one
it's
of our
insane.
very long listeners here on Climate Chat made this comment: trees don't sequester carbon, forests do. Do you have any thoughts on that? Like talking about monoculture forests versus really rewilding, where you have a diverse species and things like that. And
It's an interesting, complicated question, actually, because in fact, trees do sequester carbon. And in fact, some of those tree plantations, which are a biodiversity disaster, um, but particularly with those really fast growing trees, they can remove carbon from the atmosphere even faster than a forest can. Now it has other downsides and resilience downsides, biodiversity downsides, and of course, since they're mostly being grown just to be cut down, which a natural forest is not, there are carbon downsides there as well. That
mm,
said, it's like again, I'm trying to get people to think about land differently. Where every acre of land everywhere on Earth has some potential. It can grow food. It can shelter human beings. It can store carbon. Uh, it can grow wood for trees. There are a lot of things it can do, and there are trade-offs between all those things. And I'm saying that we need to think about using land efficiently, including land for nature. Some land is really awesome at being nature, and we got to protect that land as nature.
mm-hmm. Okay. And
Um,
any others there? Because I looked through. But
yeah. Well, Geosphere had asked earlier, can you sustainably grow plants without animals?
Why not?
I mean, globally? I mean,
Well,
I think I know. I think I
Oh, without poop,
suspect
you
this
mean, or
is
something?
I
yeah,
suspect this is about the way sort of wild ruminants contributed to, you
yes.
know, thriving ecosystems in the plains. And so the answer is like that is like, again, there's better and there's worse. And that is true. Like, you know, they are part of a nitrogen cycle, they are part of a carbon cycle. And there's some like there are some ways that wild ruminants can be really benign and in fact really helpful in maintaining ecosystems. That said, generally, um, you know, it's like there's a reason I said it's not the how, it's the cow. And for example, people are always like, oh, pastures, those pastures aren't doing anything else, and the, you know, the cattle are necessary. 40% of pastures globally were used to be forests. So there's a huge opportunity cost to running cattle on that land. That said, there are some land where you can, you know, thoughtfully managed grazing can actually, you know, increase the grass growth, the carbon growth, you know, a lot for grass, a little bit for carbon, but that's great, and I got no problem with it. And that's sort of not the place to start. But there is a lot of this, you know, we do forget. Again, a lot of this is opportunity cost. We think of land like Indiana was 85% forested, and so we think of like deforestation as like what's happening in Brazil, right? Oh, they're like, you know, their soy and cattle are moving into the Amazon. And that's true. And that's like, we should try to have less of that. But it's not like the people farming soy in Indiana are any different than the people farming soy in Brazil. It's just that we got rid of our Amazon 150 years ago. And so that's what I'm trying to promote, that kind of thinking.
Wow.
Yeah.
Michael, it's been,
Um,
I think I looked at the question. I think those, we
well,
covered
there was
most.
just one that I am really curious about as
Okay.
well. Bob had asked earlier, how are you all responding to rural opposition to solar farms? I noticed that in North Carolina, they've
Great
taken a
question.
lot of the tobacco farms and repurposed them to solar. Um, but they've also picked up the slack on animal ag as well. But I'm just curious, is there opposition
I,
to using the land as
Yeah,
solar?
it's there. I wrote about this a little bit in the book when I get to my solutions, because this is another one of those first do no harm. And that in a couple thousand rural counties in the United States have either banned or put real restrictions on putting solar and wind on farmland. And so first of all, who's getting screwed by that? The farmers
The
who would
farmer, of
like to
course.
make income by using some of their land for solar and wind. Like, there are parts, and this is not very politically correct, but there in some farmers who maybe didn't take gender sensitivity training, they call their windmills, they call it the second wife, because it's like getting more income, just like their wife does. And I think it's outrageous that they're not allowed to do that, particularly when it's you know, when it's something that's providing clean electricity that can be used on the farm. I will say, as somebody who just wrote a book called We Are Eating the Earth, that's about essentially land use, it really frosts me when I hear people saying like, oh, you know, solar and wind it's because they use too much land.
Right.
Well, I have never heard any of those people complain about how much land ethanol uses. And actually, 1 acre of solar panels produces about as much electricity, or about as much energy as 100 acres of corn grown for ethanol. So
I also heard
it's
that you
just,
could take half the land used for growing corn for ethanol, just half of that, and power the entire United States.
that would be about 45 million acres. That's right. You would need batteries. You would need
Yeah,
batteries
well,
to
yeah, just in
store the
terms of
solar at night.
generation.
But yeah, that would do it.
So
That's
that helps
that would
put it in
be
perspective. If you're really worried
yeah,
about land for solar, you're
exactly.
barking up the
Well,
wrong tree.
ethanol provides, you know, well, we use that 45 million acres for ethanol, and it provides 10% of our you know, of our passenger fuel. So
Yeah.
again,
Wow.
not
Anyway,
good.
Michael's fascinating, and the discussion's fascinating. The book is fascinating. I want to pop that up here again. For We Are Eating the Earth. the race to fix our food system and save our climate. Michael, fascinating discussion. Links in the description to Simon and Schuster's the page on the book. Thank you for doing all this, and again, for someone who's been talking about climate for 20 years or so, and talking about agriculture. I mean, it comes up, but it doesn't get the focus that it should, and you're helping to do that. So I want to thank you for that.
Oh, thank you. There's a funny scene in my introduction where I talk about, I don't know if you've had Dave Roberts on your show. I think he's like a wonderful climate journalist.
Not yet.
But he on his podcast, and he had Michael Liebrich, who's also another great climate analyst, and they were both talking about how these are two of the most knowledgeable climate authorities on earth, I think. And they were both talking about how they don't know anything about agriculture and they really ought to learn. And they were like, yeah, we really ought to learn. I've said this to Dave when I went on his show, and I'm saying it to you. I'm glad that you're, I really want people to start grappling with it. And I'm glad you're trying.
Well, actually, I'm learning. I mean, I know a lot about agriculture because that I mentioned I did that TED Talk, but I've worked with that company that has this product, helps farmers. So I've been walking across farms in Mexico and India and things like that, and learning about firsthand what it's like for these farmers in very degraded conditions, by the way, and it's getting worse because of climate change. So yeah, I've been spending some time, but that's really a little different than viewing the farming system as this climate impact. You're just trying to help that farmer grow more food with less water, and that's that goal, which is good. But you're really putting the whole thing in perspective, and it is incredible. It's an incredible story. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much.
And thanks everyone for listening. Remember, as Stacey said, like and subscribe, please. We don't ask for that enough on the show, like everybody else does on YouTube. But it is important. It gets the message out to more people. This is a very important message for people to understand. So again, Michael, thanks. And to everyone else, we will see you next time. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.